The Jane and Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge of today isn't here by chance. In the early 1940s, J. Norwood Darling, for whom the refuge is now named, was instrumental in the effort to block the sale of environmentally valuable land to developers. Ultimately, at his urging, President Harry S. Truman signed an executive order creating this refuge in 1945. In 1982, the Ding Darling Wildlife Society Friends of the Refuge began. Its purpose was to educate visitors about the importance of protecting lands, waters, and wildlife. In 1999, this group of volunteers stepped up to lead the building of the refuge's Visitor and Education Center. This was the first partnership of its kind, where a friends group raised money to construct a federal building. And it is still the hub of the refuge today. Why was this necessary? And what is the Society's role today? Well, over the decades, the refuge budget has been cut 60%, and it has half the staff it formerly did. Meanwhile, visitors have increased 66% to nearly 1 million people annually. The refuge cannot meet their growing needs alone, so the Ding Darling Wildlife Society works to fill in the gaps where federal funding falls short. Most importantly, the refuge keeps Ding Darling's spirit alive by educating generation after generation about the importance of conservation, so visitors from around the world will take that knowledge back to the communities where they live. Today, with the help of generous donors, the Society supports the refuge in these primary areas: land acquisition and restoration, advocacy, conservation education, wildlife protection, biology and water quality research, and internships.
What really draws people to Sanibel and the core objective of people is to come and enjoy the J.N. Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge. I think Ding Darling would just be ecstatic over the fact that there are people that are carrying on his legacy. I mean, he obviously gave from his pocketbook, gave from his heart, but he would be ever so gratified to know that that legacy that he started continues today.
The best legacies are not what you do for yourself today, but what you do for the next generation.
I wanted to be at the refuge because there were things that I could do here. Every time I come to volunteer, I see the important work that's being done by the Ding Darling Wildlife Society. I see the smile on children's faces and families who are enjoying nature and wildlife. It is so wonderful, it really is, to know that all of this work will be protected for the next generation because of the work that the Society has accomplished. Because if we don't do it, who will? Who will do it?
To that end, the Ding Darling Wildlife Society is dedicated to ensuring that Ding's legacy lives on at the J.N. Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge. We invite you to join us and our thousands of members in supporting the refuge for generations to come.
So that's who we are, and we want to thank everybody for having an interest in conservation and wildlife and all the things that are taking place here on the island and at the refuge. We couldn't do it without philanthropy. As you heard, the refuge is short-staffed and underfunded, and the Friends Group helps support those gaps. These lectures would not happen without our sponsors, and a big special thank you to Diane Esslinger and the Jenny and Kyle Foundation. Again, sponsors of this lecture. Very excited to hear from Doug, and thank you to our sponsors for this lecture. But what do we all think of nature? Writer Doug Chadwick's fresh look at humans' place in the natural world approaches the subject from a scientific angle, with the underlying message that from the perspective of DNA, humans are not all that different from any other creature. Wild biologist, author, photographer, frequent National Geographic contributor, he is the author of numerous books and hundreds of articles on wildlife and wild places. He has studied mountain goats among the peaks of Rockies, carried out surveys of grizzly bears and harlequin ducks that breed along the Rockies' fast-moving rivers and streams. He is on the ground amongst the animals. Doug is a founding board member of the Vital Ground Foundation, which is a conservation land trust, and serves on the board of the Liz Claiborne Art Ortenberg Foundation, which supports wildlife research and community conservation programs. In his new book, 4/5 a Grizzly, which is available, we have it out front if you'd like to purchase a book in the nature store, Doug presents an engaging series of personal essays that argue for the amazing interconnectedness of nature, advocating that the path toward conservation begins with how we see our place in the world. Gathered from decades of observing and reporting, he challenges anyone to consider whether we are separate from or part of nature. So please join me in welcoming Doug Chadwick.
Thank you. Well, as Margie just suggested, this book is not really 4/5 about grizzly bears. It is about the nature of nature and how we think about it and how we think about ourselves in relation to it. Just two thoughts. One is that here on the only living planet we know, 99.99% of all the creatures that define this living planet are invisible to the naked eye. And the other part to keep in mind is that, as Virgie suggested, it's all about the connections between the different life forms and between us and the rest of them. So that sounds kind of pretty serious and theoretical. So what I really want to do is show you my baby picture. So, and everybody says it's adorable. So there it is. This is to point out that I started life as a microbe, as all of us did. I was 4/1000ths of an inch in diameter. There were bacteria and amoeba bigger than I was. But I had plans. And I ended up as, a full-size human with about 30 trillion human cells. But I have more cells than that on me. And they are bacteria, archaea, protozoans, fungus, like yeast. And they are doing my digesting for me. You probably know this, and because you probably have probiotics and an interest in it. They are maintaining our health. They are producing hormones and other chemicals that are very similar or identical to the ones we produce, including feel-good chemicals like serotonin and dopamine that determine our moods or influence them, our actions and our thoughts. One more thing. In every human cell that I have, you have, and every plant cell, and every fungus, and every protozoan, there are these little organelles called mitochondria. And I hope if you're a biologist, this is sounding like really low-level introductory bio 101, but not everyone knows that these are the fuel cells, the energy producers, that allow us to move and feel and think and reproduce. Without them, we wouldn't live. And they are highly modified ancient bacteria. So you can add that to our partnership with other life forms. So these are notes to myself, don't mind that. I relate to the world in an I, me, mine frame of mind. But in reality, I function as an us. And it's the same for everybody, and it's the same for most living creatures that we can see. You've got coral reefs here in Florida, of course, and I was caving at about 10,000 feet in the Bighorn Mountains of Montana and crawling on my back through a tunnel, and I'm looking at a coral reef that was 500 million years old. Been around a long time, built much of the world, built most of Florida, and they are also a combo critter. a joint venture, a partnership between a polyp, anemone-like polyp, and algae. And it turns out also with cyanobacteria, which are capable of photosynthesizing like the algae and producing food for the coral, and other bacteria that can digest chitin, which is the covering or exoskeleton of all the little crustaceans that the polyps are feeding on with their tentacles. So it's more of a symbiosis. And when you have multiple symbionts in a community, like we do inside us, that makes you a holobiont. It makes coral a holobiont. Lichens, you probably know, which cover 6% of the world's surface, are a combination of algae and fungus. They were identified as a plant. No, they're a symbiont. They're a combination creature. And it turns out there's always two kinds of fungus. There's also cyanobacteria. There's a lot of other things. It's a little mini ecosystem. So much like us, I feel like I don't go around thinking this when I'm strolling down the street, but I am a walking, talking ecosystem. So are you. And, oh, what about an ordinary tree? Any tree, any plant, or shrub. What exactly is it? Like, or similar to a lichen, there's this green part of the tree, like the lichen's algae, but the roots are connected to fine fungal threads called mycorrhizae. Maybe a lot of you know this, but these fine and mostly invisible filaments go out from the root hairs of the plant for hundreds or even thousands of miles from one tree. And they're searching through the pores in the soil and finding water and minerals, bringing it back to the plant in return for a little sip of sugar or carbohydrates from the plant. More importantly, in some ways, these mycorrhizal networks, the underground internet, and they connect tree to tree, shrub to tree. They are sending out messages in plant hormones like, I'm under attack from insects, or I'm ready to flower, how about you? And they are between mother trees and her offspring. Anyway, what is a forest? What's a tree? What exactly where's the individual in all this? So we're very good at separating nature into, it's like having a bird identification book. We've got all the species listed, and we divide them into different categories. You know, there's the birds of prey, and there's the gallinules, and flycatchers, and so on. But it's the whole, and it's the connections. And these are the literal ones that tie together the forests out here. And in that green part of the plant that produces food, the basis of the food chain, of course, there are mitochondria in each of those cells providing the energy for ecosystems. And then, of course, the work of photosynthesis is done by these little organelles called chloroplasts, which, again, some of you may know are highly modified cyanobacteria from an ancient time. So what is a tree? And if you're in East Africa, you have all those partnerships going on in a typical tree, and then you get to the whistling thorn acacia. And it has big thorns to keep the likes of giraffes and elephants from munching it down. But it inflates some of them to make houses for ants. And on the tips of its leaves, whoops, if I don't trip and kill myself, are little sugary processes called nectaries that feed the ants. And in return for that, the ants patrol and keep the smaller grazers at bay. Other insects are very aggressive. They're defending their territory. In addition, on the soles of their feet, they've got little ridges that have symbiotic bacteria in them that produce things, chemicals that are toxic to molds and bacteria that could harm that plant. So you've got a real community of life. Now, when I go, and if you go to East Africa, I think we all are drawn by the same thing, that majestic pageant of big mammals. And this is the rainy season in the Serengeti. I spent a fair amount of time there. It's very lush, but as you probably know too, this is a region in Africa that's subject to periodic drought, and sometimes for years, severe drought. And yet it keeps producing this huge biomass of great mammals. How does it do that? This is as good as it's going to look. A lot of the time it's just bare and brown. But the key is the animals that outweigh all those big critters running around out there, and that would be the termites. And I guess in Florida, you know they eat wood, right? Montana, we don't know so much about that. But, and you probably know or have heard that they chew the wood, but the digesting is done by protozoans in their guts. And that's what I was taught. And then a couple of years ago, it turns out the digestive enzymes are produced by bacteria living in the cell walls. What did I say? Digestive enzymes are produced by bacteria living in the cell walls of the protozoans inside the termites. And that determines the fertility of a whole ecosystem in the tropics. So again, symbiosis. So why am I going on about this? It's a lot of geek science, but we are clearly in an unprecedented age. This is a growth chart of our population. This looks like bacteria in a petri dish, but we have been around for 350,000 years, we Homo sapiens. And it wasn't until about 12,000 years ago that the total human population on the planet hit its first million. And you know, when I learned about conservation and what we need to be doing to save nature, population stood here at about 2.3 or 4 billion. It's now very nearly 8 billion. So, what we've come up with in our relationship to nature, that we are separate and entitled to use as much as we want, as long as we want, wherever we want, that worked, obviously. But what worked well and worked sustainably for 8 million people, 80, 800 million, doesn't necessarily work for 8 billion. And, you know, I don't want to, I'm in a church, I don't want to give a sermon, especially doom and gloom. But this is a whole new era, and we are transforming the composition and the temperature of the airs, the water. And this graph, which is of our human population, could easily be a graph of the extinction rate of species on the planet. So, to make that a little more clear, if you look at this pie chart, that represents the living weight or biomass of all the mammals on planet Earth. The blue is the weight of humans. The gray is the weight of our livestock. And this little green wedge is all the wild mammals that still exist. And if you look over here, got to make sure I get the right button here. In just the last 50 years, half century, the total number, not of species, but total number, population of all the animals with backbones on the planet has fallen by 70%. This is not an environmental issue. It's not a passing problem. It's not a thing we should get around to fixing. This is your living planet having a stroke, especially in the geologic time frame. So we've almost lost the biggest creatures to ever roam the planet, the great whales. Where there were 25 to 50 million elephants, savanna elephants in Africa a couple centuries ago, there are now a few thousand here and there. They total maybe 300,000. It's interesting because we think of what we're losing. Yes, their majesty, the inspiration, these have tremendous communication systems. They're very elaborate social kind of network. They're very caring, they're very altruistic towards one another, and they live as long as we do or longer. The other interesting thing is they've got so many more cells than we do. I mean, they get up to 12 tons. How many cells is that? I don't know, but we know any cell can go wrong at any one time in mammals. Elephants almost never get cancer. What do we stand to learn from them? What do they have to tell us? What do the whales have to tell us about being able to communicate over thousands of miles of ocean to one another subsonically? Oh, well, we think of ourselves as, again, and I'm not saying it didn't work, but separate and superior. And just kind of like nature may be our legacy, but it's something we kind of have surpassed or liberated ourselves from. And yes, we get to see it in some places we've reserved, but it's not essential, and it's because we've got this tremendous brain and imagination and creativity. But just for perspective, this is our vaunted human brain, and this is the brain of a sperm whale. I like brains. So here we are, you can all read it, pilot whale. This is an elephant brain, it's 3 times the size of ours. And they pass on that knowledge through their vocalizations, through learning, just like we do. Where are the water holes, where are the good places to be at a certain time of year, how do you relate to other big animals, predators, that sort of thing. They have a lot to know. And whales have maps probably of half the world's oceans stuffed in that brain. And I won't go into it, but a lot of it's acoustic. So, however, I hope it wasn't too much doom and gloom, because I want to talk about what's going right. Here's our continent. The hot colors represent the greatest concentration of the big, majestic mammals in North America, both the predators and the plant eaters. And you can see it has shrunk over time from when the continent was colonized by Westerners. But here in the Rockies, where I live, up and down the crown of the continent, it is still as rich as ever. Everybody that belongs there is still there, and in pretty good numbers. This black outline is the Yellowstone to Yukon ecoregion. And it looks like this, and I'm sure you know Yellowstone, Glacier, Banff, Jasper, Nahanni Park, some others up north. These are gems. They are strongholds for wildlife. But when I look at them, they remind me very much of park systems in, say, Thailand or East Africa. They are separate, isolated remnants of nature. And so what they really are, they remind me most of all of an archipelago of oceanic islands. 80% of the extinctions since the year 1500 on Earth have taken place on oceanic islands. And because they're isolated, subject to inbreeding, subject to whatever comes through, you guys can relate, I mean, a hurricane, disease epidemic outbreak, and changing conditions. So the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative took on a 2,000-mile ecoregion in which the richest variety and diversity of big mammal life remains. And they have been working in these 2 decades to connect them so that animals and genes can flow between these strongholds. And they can adapt to changing climate, other changing conditions. And this is a success story. This is a can-do story. This is a is-getting-done story. Because in those just 2 decades, the amount of connected habitat through other public lands, through tribal lands, through easements with private landowners, through different management of lands outside of the parks. We've been able to, I say we because I work with them, but it's gone to more than 30%. And we can't have systems like this and pat ourselves on the back and say we have saved nature, truly, over time. Nature doesn't work that way. It's too dynamic. But if it's connected, we can pat ourselves on the back and say that will hold up through the decades and through the centuries. It's getting done there. I've seen similar projects in Africa, in Asia. Some are multinational efforts. So that's one of the most encouraging things going on out there. This is a bear coming from the Glacier Park area down towards Yellowstone. Right now, Yellowstone is isolated. It's genetically bound. There is no interchange between, the northern part and that southernmost area. And everybody knows Yellowstone for its bears. So this is a bear trying to get down here, really go south. And he hit I-90. And this is over a couple of years he bounced off that, I don't know how many dozen times. But he finally found a place where he could cross. And it doesn't take many animals to carry fresh genes into an isolated population to keep them going. It's a way of saying, and I know you've got Alligator Alley, you've got underpasses on that. But these connections need to be made at a large scale, but also the small scale. And this is in Banff National Park. It's a footpath for 4-legged pedestrians over the Canadian interstate. Female grizzlies with young won't cross a busy highway at all. And they are the keys, of course, to population success. So the effort has focused on, for wildlife connectivity has kind of been symbolized by the needs of grizzly bears, at least in the country where I live, in the Rockies. I relate to them really. I'm crazy about bears. I know you've got some here. You've got connectivity plans through a lot of the state to link the likes of black bears as well as the Florida panther. But in the Rockies, grizzlies carry a whole ecosystem on their backs because they live 35 years. They have a home range of hundreds of square miles, and it goes from valley bottoms to the top of 10,000-foot peaks. So if you are protecting them, if a place is good enough and big enough and wild enough to support grizzly bears over time, chances are Yet that same habitat is good for trout, trumpeter swans, elk, wolverines. Everybody belongs there. So they're what we call an umbrella species, an indicator species. They're a great focus. Brains, again, ours, our closest relative, chimpanzees, bear. They are capable of, grizzly bears are capable of learning a number of things. They are problem solvers. They are also being studied for, because of their ability to sleep through the winter, store huge amounts of fat. Up in Alaska, the bears I've been with on salmon streams are 50% fat by the time they go into their dens. When they walk, their fat goes, you can just see it jiggle. It's like jelly bears. And how do they get through 6 months of sleep without heart problems? How does their liver work to store the toxins from the metabolism that keeps them alive? This is all being studied both by medical researchers and by people from NASA trying to figure out what suspended animation might be like for humans. Who knew? I mean, I get the question in Montana from a number of folks like, what good is a goddamn grizzly bear? And, I don't want to say, well, I'm not sure what good you are, but there's a lot of answers to that. And they're my guarantee of big open spaces. Down here, your keystone species, whether it's alligators or what it might be, but there are certain animals that if we're keeping them going, things are pretty hopeful. We're doing things right. So this is just a goofy sculpture. I don't know how he even got in here, but it's like the bear, where it goes, it creates pathways for a whole community of wildlife. And I work with a land trust called Vital Ground, and we work with the grizzly as our icon to identify places that will connect existing bear populations. This is Yellowstone, Glacier Park, northern Idaho, central Idaho, where there are 0 bears, and there used to be a lot. But they're trying to make their way over there. Some have already shown up. They got killed, but if they can get there, more will come. We work with private landowners to do conservation easements, and it works. We've done about 700,000 acres worth over the last few decades. So, connections. We don't have to make super parks. We need to make wildways, habitat bridges, corridors that are good enough for these animals to move and adapt over time. And then we have what's called a metapopulation. It's not one big block, but if it's connected, it functions as a metapopulation just as effectively. And that's the future, probably, both here and where I live. So this is my reminder to say another way of looking at it, the importance of connectivity, the importance of our internal, external partnerships with other wildlife, is to have a kind of a new golden rule for the coming decades, and that's do unto ecosystems as you would have them do unto you. Nurture, sustain health, allow to flourish. It's that simple. If that's a guiding rule, I think we're going to do okay. So, yes, I claim to be 4/5 a grizzly, which is a little over the top, like, yeah, I'm just that tough. And I have spent a lot of time with them. They're very tolerant, as long as you behave correctly. I'm not trying to convince you that they're our big teddy bear friends. But anyway, the truth is, though, I am 4/5 a grizzly. I'm 4/5 every kind of bear out there, and you are too, because we share at least 80% of our genes. They're identical. So you can be any mammal you want. There are 5,400 species on the globe. You can be a 4/5 a snow leopard if you like to be that for today. But what does that mean? It means we share learning abilities, emotions, as well as all the physical characteristics that keep us going. More than 1 out of every 5 species on the planet is a bat. So I don't know how you feel about being 4/5 a bat. You notice I didn't title my book, I Am 4/5 a Bat. But you're also 4/5 a hopelessly cute red panda. You are 98 to 99% identical in your genetic makeup, your DNA, with the chimpanzee. And I think a lot of people know how closely related we are to the great apes, but they may not be aware that we share 50 to 60% of our genes with fish, 30 to 40% with insects, which seem really alien to most of us. But we're running on the same metabolic processes. And I don't know, I could go on. I mean, who knew things like an Israeli scorpion has a venom that can be used to transport drugs across the blood-brain barrier? Really hard to get drugs into the human brain to heal it. But combined with this venom, it works. Who knew people in technology would be studying ants and their hives, their systems, to design ways to most efficiently conduct traffic, which I'd say would be useful on Sanibel. Maybe not, but, and to eliminate waste or to transport supplies. Okay, yeah, 4/5 a dung beetle too. But these guys, like termites, are keeping the fertility of those tropical ecosystems and places like East Africa where we go to enjoy the rest of the life. In fact, there are, like I said, 5,400 species of mammals on the planet. We all think we're a pretty big deal. There are 400,000 species of beetles on Earth. They're the most diverse land group of creatures. And boy, there's one for every kind of shape, form, chemical production. So I did, one of the stories I did for Geographic was Planet of the Beatles, and I came in and told them, we should do this. We're about nature. A lot of National Geographic stuff is particularly oriented to that. And they said, "I have bugs. I'm not going to do a story." So I went to the Harvard Museum, got 20 of their most fabulous species of beetles, some of which are shining gold. They look like you could make a ring out of them. Some are that big, every size and weird shape in the world, and took it in and said, I still want to do a story on beetles. And I said, they're bugs. They opened up the box and it's a photography-driven magazine, right? And they said, yeah, we can do a story about beetles. I don't know what percentage of my genes I share with sea angels. I just put this in because it's such a cool critter. But it's probably 20 to 30% because we share 20-some% with worms. You are 24% a wine grape genetically. Yeah, well, everybody knows that. Okay. All right, that wasn't as shocking as I thought it would be, but anyway, these are a type of marine sea slug. See what a name difference it makes? A sea angel. And 7% of my DNA I have in common with bacteria, which if we were to take a little part of Sanibel I don't know how we do it, but if you were somehow to count the bacteria out there, it would outnumber the stars in the universe. And we share that with them. So, however broadly or narrowly one defines identical genes, I am in a sense alive in a mind-boggling number of creatures in a staggering range of environments around the globe through the DNA we share. I leap, I fly, I slither, I shimmer with iridescent scales in the waters off Zanzibar, and I stretch my petals towards the light in far northern Siberia. Being more closely related to avocados, ants, and aardvarks than most people suspect doesn't dilute our stature as humans, but instead increases it many-fold. It renders us more than human. This is our deep heritage, an old, enduring kinship as big as the living world. I think of it as our greater selves. And we can still demean people by saying you're an animal, you're a beast. And I don't know, I live among them in Montana. I've got grizzlies literally in the backyard, and everything else. But it's not hard to see myself in them and me. But at least I don't think of it as giving something up to take better care of nature and assign more rights and more of a future to other creatures. But of course, this is still a politically polarized issue, conservation. And here we are as holobionts, as joint creatures, as tied to every other life form that exists. And we're still having this debate about the importance of it. Since I just said we're all part of nature, this is how we've been looking at viruses the last couple of years, right? A little bit of photoshopping going on. And so I almost hesitate to tell people that if you stand in a square yard of ground like that for 24 hours, 800 million viruses will rain down onto you. And 8% of your genes are. Am I still on? Yeah. If it weren't for viruses, we wouldn't be able to form the human placenta. Long ago, some ancestor, proto-mammal maybe, got infected, survived, and maintained a certain segment of the genetic code brought by a virus. And that has been repurposed to forming the placenta and embedding it in the human uterus. So none of us would be here without that. Other viral remnants seem to have still very new research, but long-term memory formation is something those genes are responsible for in humans. So again, we're not quite, let's just say we're not quite what we think we are. Maybe not even close to what we think we are, or how we conceive of ourselves. One last thing of our connection with nature. In Japan and Korea, they have what's called forest bathing. Some of you have heard of that. And maybe all of you have heard of that. But it's immersing all your senses in a natural setting. Now, I know I'm talking to people on Sanibel Island, so you guys are in great shape. But when you do go into a natural setting and your heart rate slows, your blood pressure drops, your immune system becomes more active, it gets strengthened, and your cognitive functions get more clear. And there's been study after study around the world of these effects. And they, of course, translate into long-term health benefits. less problem with diabetes, with heart problems, with just a whole array of things. And that's because there's a balance between that effect of contact with nature and the effect of stressful modern situations that increase anxiety, and chronic anxiety leads to depression, leads to medical problems. And so your stress-related, well, probably a better word, but anyway, things that cause stress and anxiety, this was a very useful trait to have. This is your sympathetic nervous system. Your parasympathetic system, where your blood pressure drops and you relax and concentrate, that's very useful too. That's your rest and relaxation phase. So it's both. It's not like stressful urban situations bad, nature good, but the balance. For all those years, remember the chart of human growth. In 1800, 3% of the world's human population lived in urban areas. Everybody else was outdoors and much more in touch with nature. Now, 75% of the US is in big cities. Studies by the National Institute of Health pointed out that the average American spends 87% of his or her time indoors, like we are now. And an additional 6% inside closed forms of transportation. So that's 93% in shells of our own making. And again, it's not cities bad, nature good, but the balance of the environments we're creating for ourselves, we want to think maybe more carefully about that. Maybe another way to put it, a little contact with natural environments is healthy. More is healthier. Being involved with nature is not a particular choice, and it's not a hobby, as bird watching or flower gardening are often described. It is not any sort of special interest, the practice of a philosophy or a concern best suited to extra-sensitive types or to folks keen to preserve antique objects and historical sites, or even to hardcore outdoors enthusiasts. That's because having a relationship with nature is not optional. You've been immersed in nature since the chromosomes in your father's sperm joined those of your mother's egg. No matter what kind of activities or groups you identify with now, you stay profoundly involved with nature day and night because it built and selected the genes that in turn built you and the operating systems of your body and mind. These systems respond to nature's presence, and they respond in more subtle but very real ways to its absence, to its replacement by modern settings and stimuli. There are no exceptions. Ding Darling would understand the old model of conservation, which is kind of a compromise between the needs of the economy, the environment, other social demands, and we call it sustainable development. But Ding Darling would understand that over the long run, the economy and the society that runs on it depend on the health of the environment. Just as contact with nature makes us healthier and improves longevity, that's very clear from any number of studies, the long-term robustness of the economy depends on having variety, diversity, vitality maximized in the environment. And it shouldn't be an issue, but of course it is. And I shouldn't end a talk with charts, that's awful. But it's just to say that we've got these long-term goals for the climate, for carbon in the atmosphere, for food production, for human health. These are all international goals. We just need one for biological diversity, for the health of nature, and in which we need the equivalent, I think, of like the Paris Climate Summit, where every nation commits to keeping X% of its lands preserved and in contact or connected to one another. And we don't have that. But there's a lot more interest in that and much larger scale planning. Last reading here. An artist commissioned to illustrate the way many folks think about our position in the living world might paint a scene with us as the shining capstone atop a grand pyramid of species. Instead, the growing collection of revelations from recent studies sticks humankind within a tangled skein of other life forms. Your every friend, enemy, lover, dignitary, and desperado, along with every other animal, every plant, and every fungus you'll ever meet, exists as a union. This doesn't refer to being the product of two parents. It means each of us is by nature a collaboration or collective, a joint venture of fellow earthlings. Our newly realized position doesn't undermine our prowess and potential, doesn't make us any less amazing. Our spectrum of biological relationships makes us more than human. And being human was already pretty marvelous, for we possess an extraordinary brand of imaginative intelligence, coupled with social mechanisms for sharing and building upon information that appear to be unrivaled. So make of all those qualities all you will. But for goodness sake, don't look for insight from anybody not particularly interested in the fate of nature on a living planet, much less willing to do something about it. That holobiont missed the memo to know thyself. So I have people tell me, and maybe I know most of you are strong supporters of both the refuge and of the natural values around you. But I meet people that say, I'm glad you do that. It's wonderful. I'd like to help, but I'm just not that into nature. And dude, nature is totally into you. So what are we even talking about? Or another, there's usually a little awkward silence after that. I know you can read, but being one with nature sounds like an aspiration. It really isn't, because we already are. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Big thank you to Doug. We do have a couple of minutes if anyone has any questions before we go out.
Notice that I left very little time for awkward questions. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. Your work, your advocacy, your writing is all beautiful, and we really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you.
My question to you is, what gives you most hope moving forward? I mean, we're in a precarious situation right now.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work that's being done that looks great out in the West. But what gives you most hope for the rest of the area?
That because I said some bad things about humans, but I said we are a marvelous species. It takes a flip of the switch, I think, to see ourselves. Look, we've spent centuries building up this model of humans here, all the rest of nature there. But I think that, all the science, all the data is showing us no. It's a nice, comfortable myth that was maybe valuable at one point. So I think that can change. I'm also a willful optimist because I don't operate very well when I'm discouraged. But I also think it's really important for us enviros to not be that person that comes up and gives a talk and says, Well, here's another really horrible thing you might not know. And yeah, and here's another beautiful, elegant, graceful species going down the tubes. And how come I never get invited back to your parties, you know? It's just like, so, because we're not very good at pointing out what's going right. And there's a lot going right here. I've really enjoyed my time and can sense the dedication of a lot of people here. And I see that wherever I go. And as long as that's there and it's a model, I've got every reason to hope that that's not a very practical thing, but maybe that works for me.
Where do you live in Montana?
Right next to Glacier Park. And my wife and I lived in a log cabin for a dozen years that we built on an old logging property. It was right on the edge of the river that separates that land from Glacier Park. So we literally do have every
What's the
critter
nearest
there.
town?
The nearest town? Yeah, yeah. Well, there's Polebridge, which has like 20 people sometimes in the winter. Yeah.
Yeah, so you talked about the whales and the size of the brain, the elephant.
Yeah.
As humans, we think that we are unique in terms of social structures and technology. Is it possible that the whales and the other large brain mammals have something that we don't even see? Like, am I explaining what I'm asking you?
Yeah, I do kind of. And also, I should tell you, I did a series of stories for National Geographic on the great whales. And I remember when one would come close to the little boat we were in, they would always roll on their side and you get that big eye looking at you. And I felt like a bug on a leaf when a person bends down. I go, oh my God, it's looking at me. But it would come and interact. And I've had humpbacks come full speed at me, and I'm like, what? It's like having a 747 come at you. And then it spread those big pectoral fins, stop, your nose to nose. And you can't even see its eyes. It's a weird experience because their eyes are about 8 feet over here, But I remember getting back on the boat the first time that happened going, now what? I mean, how am I going to beat this? I just got inspected and researched by, another creature. And I have felt that with bears. I felt it with elephants for sure. And elephants have a whole language besides their trumpets and squeals and ways of communicating, and it's subsonic. And you don't hear it, you feel it in your bones, just like you feel a lot of whale communications. It reverberates. All you see in the elephant is the fluttering of the forehead as the sinuses create these sounds. But I'd give anything to know what they're talking about. But I know that they're saying things about us. And killer whales are another. I'm starting to see papers in scientific journals comparing killer whale cultures. Each pod has a separate language or dialect, knows different things. They live 80, 90 years as we can. And anyway, a lot of ways of signaling and talking to one another, but comparing the social structure and communication ability of killer whales to tribes. It's like doing anthropology, I guess, is what I'm saying. So wherever I see that kind of integrating between people, how we study people, how we study animals, I love that. Because before it was like it's an other. And if we get past that barrier, all things are possible. Yeah.
Two questions. One, where were you in this whale experience? Where was it?
Oh, the whale experience? In the Au Channel between Lanai and thank you. Yeah, Maui.
Lahaina?
Yeah, out of Lahaina.
You saw the baby whale?
Well, we had, I was working with researchers who had permission for us to get in the water with them. And that's really hard to get. And we could watch their behavior. It wasn't always a good idea, because one time I was a young male, only 35 feet long, zooming all around me being a juvenile delinquent, and then he disappeared and I'm still underwater and we're just using snorkels. And I surfaced to get a breath and he's up there, he's breached, and it's like, so not always fun.
Are you not worried if you're gonna snorkel, they won't hurt you in the water?
No, they're aware of where you are. They could be coming right at you and you think you're doomed, and then the fin goes over you like that. No, I don't know of any. I mean, it could happen accidentally.
Yeah. My other two common questions were, in our lives, to help best assist these efforts, what organizations do you think are best to contribute to and to support?
Oh boy, that's a huge question.
Well, you know, I can get literature from everybody.
Yeah, I know, I do too. Yeah. May I suggest? Yeah, she's kicking me behind the table. No, I was actually going to say that, but look, I work with another foundation that supports international research and conservation, and the groups we support are ones I would recommend, and that's the Wildlife Conservation Society. They do a very good job abroad. There's another one called Island Conservation, and they remove non-native species from these oceanic islands where so many extinctions have occurred. And it's wondrous. Rats, cats. It's not glamorous. You know, it's not that kind of conservation, but you go out and take the rats off an island, and the seabirds worldwide have declined 70% in half a century. And it's mostly rats. You take the rats off, 2 years later, air's full of wings. The plants that you thought were extinct, dormant seeds have sprouted and they're coming back. It was just a whole different world. If you like fast results, that group does wonders, and they do it worldwide. So that's two favorites. The other is, are you talking globally or North America?
Either or, if we're on this earth and we want to help somewhere, what are a couple of the best places to donate?
Well, have a peek at the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. It's y2y.net. And since you're promoting this, I'm going to say have a look at vitalground.org. Do you have any suggestions, others?
Other than that,
All right.
we are out of time, but Doug is going to stick around for a little bit after. I know some people have some other things to go to, but big thank you to Doug.
Yeah.
Another round of
Thank you.